Hello everyone, I'd like to once again welcome you to my channel. Today I'm going to discuss the heterotrophic theory of life, mainly focusing on the primordial soup. We've heard many times when it comes to the origin of life, especially from atheists, that they believe life began from the primordial soup and then it evolved all the way up until Homo-Sapiens, human beings as we now know. Now I believe there are some serious holes in this theory, and I'd like to point some of them out today. Now when we hear about the primordial soup, the Google definition for primordial soup is a solution rich in organic compounds in the primitive oceans of the earth, from which life is hypothesized to have originated. So we have a solution rich in organic compounds millions of years ago, back then, and these compounds form the building blocks of life. How they came together, there are many theories of how it came together. Some believe it's some electrical cosmic event that gave the energy needed for life to come from this thing. But what the theory posits is that from these chemicals in the oceans, a self-replicating single-celled organism which was able to synthesize the light of the sun came forth. So we have a single-celled, self-replicating organism which is able to perform photosynthesis. And therefore this organism, which came from the primordial slime, led to the evolution of life. I have two major points to contend when it comes to the primordial soup. The first point I'd like to mention is, how did such a complex structure arise by chance out of the primordial soup? Now when I say complex structure, remember that this single-celled organism was able to photosynthesize, right? It was able to synthesize the light from the sun. Now, I'm not going to think about the whole structure of this cell. One of the biggest flaws when it comes to atheists, when it comes to the origin of life, is that they treat the single-celled organism as a very simple structure. Anyone with any scientific background who looks at a single-celled organism realizes that this thing is extremely complex. So I will give them a helping hand and not even examine the whole structure of a single-celled organism. I will just look at the structure of a chloroplast. Now, a chloroplast is the light-sensitive structure in chlorophyll, which is what gives leaves the green colors, and that is how they are able to photosynthesize, or basically synthesize the light of the sun. I am going to look at only the structure of the chloroplast. Now, when we look at the structure of the chloroplast, according to our diagram right here, we see many different things. We see the chloroplast envelope, we see the thalcaloid, the granum, nucleoid, ribosome or ribosome. We see all these many structures inside of the chloroplast. But there is one thing I really want to point out. there is something which we see in this diagram which says membranes. Membranes. Now, what are membranes? I believe membranes, when you think about what membranes are, it completely dismantles the whole primordial slime theory. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, membranes consist largely of a lipid bilayer, which is a double layer of phospholipid cholesterol and glycolipid molecules that contains chains of fatty acids and determines whether a membrane is formed into long flat sheets or round vesicles. Lipids give cell membranes a fluid character with a consistency approaching that of a light oil. Fatty acid chains allow many small fat-soluble molecules such as oxygen to permeate the membrane, but they repel water-soluble molecules such as sugar and electrically charged ions such as calcium. Embedded in the lipid bilayer are large proteins, many of which transport ions and water-soluble molecules across the membrane. Some proteins in the plasma membrane form open pores such as membrane channels, which allow the free diffusions of ions into and out of the cell. Others bind the specific molecules on one side of a membrane and transport the molecule to the other side. Sometimes one protein simultaneously transports two types of molecules in opposite directions. Most plasma membranes are about 50% protein by weight, while the membranes of some metabolically active organelles are 75% protein. Attached to proteins on the outside of the plasma membranes are long carbohydrate molecules. Now that's a lot of reading. That sounds like a very, very complex structure, those membranes. And when you look at the chloroplast, we have the outer membrane, we have the inner membrane, we have the thalcoloid membrane. We have in this simple structure inside of this single cell self-replicating photosynthesizing cell, we have three membranes. How in the world did these three membranes develop from the primordial soup by chance? If even one membrane was able to be formed, how in the world did the two other membranes form? When you look at the structures inside the chloroplast, each one is surrounded by a membrane. The membrane protects it and separates it from the other structures inside of the chloroplast. So without these membranes, all the fluids and all the compounds, everything in there would just form a soup. Maybe a primordial soup, right? It'll form a soup. It wouldn't be able to function as a chloroplast because everything would just be a soup. They need the membranes to form the structure of the cells and also form the structure of the mini parts inside of the cell. How in the world did this happen by chance? This is one of this is one reason why intelligent design is such a strong argument for the existence of God. Intelligent design. So that's my first one. My first point was, how did such a complex structure arise by chance out of the primordial soup? Membranes is a very big clue that this theory is flawed. There is no way that could happen by chance. Now my second point is, how did such small structures not be contaminated by surrounding contaminants? Right? How did it not be contaminated by the surrounding contaminants. When you look at let's say the microchip industry, the smaller and smaller things get, the more difficult it is to keep clean, and also the greater the need to shield it from outside contaminants. Because once you go to such a micro scale, a scale so small, even a grain of dust could be a contaminant that can create problems. That's why in industries, let's say in the fabs of Intel, there are clean rooms where everyone is covered, everyone have suits on, these clean room suits on, and the place is kept impeccably clean to reduce dust, eliminate microbes, all this stuff. How can we have the primordial soup just floating in the oceans of the earth? We can have a single cell organism, something so small, form with all those membranes, all this structure, and not have outside contaminants coming in and destroying the life of that cell even before it forms. How can that be possible? There is absolutely no explanation for it. Everyone just treats the primordial soup like, oh my goodness, back then the oceans were completely pure. The ocean was a giant clean room. There were no contaminants. You know, there were no elements other than those organic compounds and stuff needed for the origin of life. Oh really? There was nothing else in the ocean? There was no salt in there? No, there was no other chemicals floating in this ocean? That once you examine this theory and give it a little bit of thought, everything just falls apart. They just say, oh, you know what? Given millions of years, eventually the conditions became suitable. Each time these holes are pointed out in this theory, they extend the timeline, give it a few extra million years, few more opportunities for chance to come in, and eventually life would form. We'd have this single cell structure forming from the primordial soup. The theory makes no sense. It doesn't stand up to scientific scrutiny. It doesn't work out. So these are my 2 points, and I hope these 2 points will enlighten and will show the flaws in this theory and put to bed the whole idea of the primordial soup. I don't think it works. I don't think it's a good theory, and I think intelligent design, in God being the original creator, is the truth. Nothing else stands up to it, and definitely not primordial slime. Thank you for your time.